Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Looking back over the past year, it's been a relatively easy year or an almost perfect year for tillage crops. The harvest in 2021 went smoothly, which is followed by an excellent period in the autumn to get crops established. The spring in 2022 was also excellent for getting crops planted, and the growing season has been excellent so far. Despite the very high cost of inputs, crops appear to be green and healthy and all have good promise. Are we looking at a bumper harvest in 2022, I wonder? Today I'm joined by Shay, Phelan and Ciarán Collins, both Tillage Specialists in Teagasc, to chat about crops so far this year and if there's any other lessons which we can learn from growing crops this year. Ciarán, winter barley crops are beginning to turn. What sort of prospects are in the crops at the moment?
I suppose winter barley, 3 weeks will probably bring in some of the earliest of the crops. It's probably of all the crops this year, winter barley is probably the one that's maybe the comment a little bit mixed might be apt, in the sense that while there are some very nice crops of winter barley out there, there are also some crops maybe where obviously barley yellow dwarf virus hits some of them, and I suppose it remains to be seen maybe some of the consequences of that. Secondly, I suppose walking through crops of winter barley in recent weeks, there may be the head count might be a little bit slacker than you'd like, so as I said, of all the crops, it is a little bit of a mixed bag with winter barley, really.
Okay, was disease, Ciarán, an issue this year, or were crops relatively clean from start to finish?
Generally, crops were relatively clean. I suppose, look, we did have little bits of disease earlier on, but I think, again, spray programs were well timed. So in terms of rinco, net blotch, mildew, I wouldn't have said that they would have caused any great issues. I suppose the obvious one that everybody would be commenting on in recent weeks is the level of raw malaria in crops, and I think all crops have some level of raw malaria, and it's almost like a sprint now to the finish line between the raw malaria and maybe the natural senescence of the crop. And I think from the crops I'm seeing in the majority of cases, I don't think raw malaria is going to have a huge impact, but there will be odd exceptions out there.
Okay, so the prospects are relatively good, I suppose, one year with the other.
I would think so. A good average is what it looks, but the combine will dictate, I suppose.
As we're talking about disease, Shay, I might bring you in there in terms of winter wheat. How would this year be classed as a disease year in winter wheat?
I suppose, Michael, the way to classify it really is it has been a relatively low pressure year from the point of view certainly of septoria. There are a few guys growing a few varieties that are susceptible to yellow rust, but they're few and far between. So by far and away, it's the most worrying disease that we would have had this year is septoria. But I mean, the current weather is kind of symptomatic of what we have. We're looking for rain at the moment, so it's been kind of similar that way most way through the year. And that coming into kind of the early part of May, there wasn't a whole lot of rain in April, so actually the levels of septoria were actually quite low to begin with. And on top of that, even though May was kind of tricky from the point of view of spraying opportunities, it was quite windy. Most people were able to get their fungicide applications done on time. So when they needed to get it done, they were able to get it done. So that has helped no end in terms of controlling septoria. Having said that, I'm literally only after coming back in from looking at some trials here in Knockbeg, and where there are say mishaps or mistimed applications, there is a nice bit of septoria around there. So it isn't gone away, it is there. But for the most part, I would say most growers got what they needed to do done on time. So for those crops, they should be okay.
And what about fusarium, Shay? There was a good bit of rain there around the time when flowering was occurring on wheat. Is it too early to know whether that is going to be a problem in wheat or not?
It is a bit yet, Michael. As you say, it was catchy and was some rain in certain parts of the world when flowering was going on. But I think what's crucial is that you were getting dry periods within those as well. So it wasn't like that crops were essentially wet from the start of flowering all the way through to the end. So from that point of view, crops did get a chance to dry out, and you would hope that would lessen the risk of fusarium, but we won't know that for another couple of weeks yet. It'll be close to the harvest time before we really see those effects. But as I say, probably wasn't the highest pressure year from a fusarium point of view either, given that there was quite a bit of drying there over the last.
Okay, so we have crops that were well established or seem to be seem to be a big crop from hedge to hedge or ditch to ditch, if you like. There seems to be plenty of heads there. So are we going to look at a bumper year for winter wheat, do you think, Shay?
The potential is certainly there, Michael. I mean, unlike what Ciarán was saying with the winter barley, wheat does have that element of compensation, so it can compensate for a slightly poorer stand. And like I said, our biggest risk with winter wheat not yielding is bare patches or disease. And so far, we see that crops are, as you say, full crops from hedge to hedge. There's no waterlogged patches anywhere for the most part. And likewise, disease has been kept at bay for the most part as well. So I would say, yeah, we possibly could be looking at, now it all has to be harvested yet, of course, but we are possibly looking at good yields there this year, yeah.
Okay, and Ciarán, come back to you in terms of oats. We've 2 good crops already talked about. Will oats do something similar? Are there good crops out there?
There are. I suppose the bar was set very high last year, especially with spring oats, I suppose, in terms of record yields, and winter oats. It was an exceptional year last year as well. But to be fair, I think the majority of winter oat crops that I've seen this year are good. We certainly did have mildew in the early part of the spring, and it was noticeable, but probably a little bit of a consequence of some of that milder weather in the autumn stroke winter time. And, you were seeing a good degree of mildew in some crops, particularly kind of shelter crops. But then I suppose drier weather in April in particular, allowed, people to get on, I suppose, with fungicides, and then obviously the weather suited in terms of controlling mildew. So thereafter, I think disease levels in oats has been relatively low. And a little bit like Shay's comment, I suppose, the stand with winter oats in particular, and I can add spring oats into that bracket as well, is quite good, So I think one thing with another, there's good potential in both winter and spring oats this year, really, Michael.
So, Ciarán, winter oats is looking good, but if we were to look back to all of the winter cereals there, is there any lessons that farmers can learn from, I suppose, the last season in terms of how crops are managed?
Yeah, I certainly think so. In terms of sowing date is one, I suppose, that would jump out at you. And I spoke about BYDV in relation to winter barley, and obviously the highest pressure is going to come from early sowing. We don't know the day we sow what type of weather we're going to get over the winter, whether it'll be, mild like it was this year, or, cool and wet like the previous year. So certainly early sowing then, and, problems like BYDV exacerbated then by mild weather over the winter. So sowing date is definitely a factor. And also, I think we shouldn't forget about take-all. Certainly early sowing can impact, and we haven't seen a huge amount of take-all recently, but I certainly have seen some of that in winter barley recently, and maybe that's a factor with some of the winter barley as well, that's sown a little bit earlier, where it's not in, and as it tends not to be in an ideal slot really. So I suppose, Michael, to answer your question in relation to lessons, certainly early sowing date it can be a factor at times.
Okay, a little bit more problems are going to arise with that. But I suppose, Shay, turning back to early sowing, and oilseed rape kind of goes in there in terms of it's one of the first crops that are going to be in. And if we're looking at oilseed rape out there at the moment, it's flowering as well over, and pods are filling at the moment. Where do you think crops are in terms of desiccation? Are crops coming up to that stage at the moment?
Yeah, from what crops I've looked at in the last couple of days, Michael, we're probably maybe a week, maybe 10 days in some crops away from desiccation. When you actually split the pods at the moment, and we were looking at the ones in the main raceme now particularly, they're still quite green. So the seeds in them are still quite green. So they're just not there yet. We want to see those seeds going from green to brown, and maybe even dark brown. And again, on the main raceme. So they're not there yet. They're probably in some cases, maybe, like I say, a week or 10 days away yet.
So go back now, just so everyone understands, the main raceme, that's the main stem you're talking about?
The main stem on the plant. So you're taking your samples from that, not the side ones, because they will tend to be a little bit behind the main stem, if you like. So you take your samples from those, split the pods open, look at your seeds. If they're starting to go from green to brown in more than, say, 30 to 40% of the cases, you're starting to get close with there then at that stage. So you're probably a couple of days away at that stage. But ideally, I like to see them kind of nearly all brown in those pods if I can at all, and I spray it then.
So it's I suppose crops are fantastic out there this year. There's lots of really heavy canopies. How important is it that growers get into the middle of those to see whether, the middle of the field reflects what's inside the gate? Because I'll tell you one thing, it takes a strong person to get through some of them, I think.
Yeah, you're right, Michael. It is a challenge. There's no doubt about that, getting through them now at this stage. The one thing I would say this year is quite a lot of crops were sprayed probably relatively late for Sclerotinia, certainly later than I would have liked to see them. So for a lot of those crops, there are tram lines, probably that are accessible. Now, it's still tough walking through them. But obviously, the more you get into the crop, the better the view you get of the type of crop there, how far it is. Because as you rightly say, most guys just go as far as the gate and go inside the gate. And quite often that can be the poorest part of the crop and one that turns earlier because it might be, it might be affected by compaction around the gateways and things like that. So the further you get into the crop, the more realistic a picture you will get of the crop.
And it's glyphosate that farmers are going to be using to desiccate the crops. What sort of rate are people going to be using, and is there any differences? Because there are lots of different trade names and bits and pieces of glyphosate out there. Is there differences between them?
Yeah, there are, Michael. There as you say, there are generics out there. There are all, and you have your normal roundups as well. So you literally have to look at the concentrations of each of them. Some of them have 360 grams, which are probably the most 360 grams per liter, should I say, which are the most common ones. So like Roundup Biactive, Roundup XL, Gallup XL, those type of things are all 360. Then you have some of them at 450 grams, and you have some even at 700 grams. So you have to look at the concentration on each one. You're probably looking for most of those somewhere in the region of about between, depending on the crop and if there are any other weeds there, between 700 and maybe even 900 grams a litre, or 900 grams per hectare of active ingredient. So you need quite a bit of actual glyphosate to try and take the crop down, because it's quite a big canopy that you're trying to take down, and it does take 3 to 4 weeks to actually take them down.
Okay, and there's often lots of talk about putting in an adjuvant or a pod sticker, as they call it, a product that will help pod shatter or help stop pod shatter. Is that worth considering at all?
Most varieties now, Michael, kind of have a certain resistance to pod shatter, but you're right, a lot of people still put in stickers and stuff like that. Personally, I'm not convinced by them. I think if the varieties contain that pod shatter resistance, I think that's generally good enough. I suppose what's more important is how you actually cut the crop when you are actually cutting it, not to shatter the crop before it actually gets onto the table.
Okay, thanks, Shay. Ciarán, come back to you. Just go back and having a quick look around some of the spring crops. I mean, I think in fairness, they got a brilliant chance this year in terms of the sowing conditions that were really, really good and kind of got off to a good start. How are they looking now? Are they looking every bit as well as we hope they do?
They are, to be fair, I suppose, like you said, Michael, sowing conditions in March, the end of March and into early April were excellent. And I suppose that's when the majority of spring crops were sown. I suppose looking at spring barley, obviously being the main spring crop, good establishment. And again, disease-wise and controlling disease hasn't been a big issue. That's not to say it was non-existent, because we certainly did see plenty of net blotch and the likes of Planet, which obviously is quite susceptible. But I think where spray timings were good, it hasn't really been too much of a challenge. So all in all, spring crops and especially spring barley are looking well. They've grown well, even to the point that I just think that some of them actually are a little bit taller than normal, which is always a good sign of a good growing season. And again, look, the final spray timings went on well. So again, in terms of from a Romalaria perspective, we're not really seeing anything yet, but there is time for that. But hopefully, given the timings were good, that won't be an issue in spring barley this year.
Is BYDV the only fly in the ointment, so to speak, at the moment then?
Yeah, again, it is. There's plenty of BYDV around, and it was not as obvious now as it would have been obviously 2-3 weeks ago. But when you actually look into a lot of crops that appear to the eye to have a lot of infection, you actually do measurements, the percentage can actually be quite low. Anything, I would have said the vast majority of the crops had less than 5% infection, some a little bit higher, certainly maybe 7, 8, 9%, So I suppose the level of BYDV isn't massively high. Secondly, then we don't see, like we've seen in some of the winter barley, some of this typical stunting and that. So again, depending on the strains that are there, and we have seen this in the recent past where we've had a relatively high level of BYDV infection in spring barley, but yet not having a significant impact on yield. Now, time will tell on that one, but I suppose we certainly wouldn't be as concerned as maybe we might be with winter barley.
Okay. Shay, can I come back to you just in terms of the, we talked about, I suppose, lessons that can be learned over the season gone by. Is there anything else farmers can do at the moment to, I suppose, try and pick up more of those lessons either from their own farms or other farms around there?
Yeah, I think it's a very important time, Michael, actually, to learn the lessons that have happened during the year. And you're right, farmers should be walking their own crops and looking to see what's worked this year, and more crucially, what didn't work, and what the legacy of those are. And take notes down for each individual crop and field and see what's there. But the other thing that farmers should be doing is they should be going to open days and any other demonstrations that are around. And there are lots of different opportunities to go and see, whether it's variety trials, whether it's disease trials or open days. And we're running a series of farm walks ourselves next week, looking at the signpost program and also the IPM works. And there's a lot of information to be garnered at those sort of events as well. So really and truly, I suppose this is a time of year where farmers can learn from not only the mistakes, but what actually worked well for the year gone out. And not only in their own farms, but there's plenty of opportunity to learn from others as well. So really, this should be getting out and going to these different events and trying to learn what's there.
Okay, and where will people find out more information about that, Jay?
So those farm walks that we're running are on our website. There's adverts going out in the national papers. Local advisory offices will have the details. So and they're on our website, as I say, as well. So there's plenty of advertisement there.
I suppose if people Google teagasc.ie/events, they'll probably stumble upon them there.
They'll get them there, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Shay. Ciarán, can I just finally come to you in terms of, I suppose, look, it's not just about growing the crop at the end of the day, it's about getting a result and getting grain out of it the far side. It's been a very expensive year for farmers in terms of input costs. Where do you think the current state of play is as regards output prices? They were looking good. They've come off the boil a little bit, but are they still looking pretty good?
Yeah, I suppose, look, Michael, if we look at the 5 or even the 10-year average, obviously we're at the peak of it, really. And I suppose that's the positive. And like you said, look, a lot of that's needed. Fertilizer obviously was very expensive, for a lot of growers this season, and we're heading into a harvest with very high fuel prices as well. So that's the price that's there at the moment is welcome. I suppose, like you said, it is gone off the boil a little bit. The most recent kind of green prices that I have would be in the range of barley 310, 315, and wheat maybe 325, 330. But when I was looking back in around the 17th of May, I remember getting a text for barley at 343, so 310 today, and the most recent quote that I got there, 315. So, as you say, that is there. I suppose it's very difficult for any grower to say, well, I'm going to fix my price at a certain point in time. And the indications from the industry would be that most farmers have chosen to kind of wait for the harvest price. And I suppose there is a little bit of apprehension there because, while the winter barley harvest mightn't be any more than 3 weeks away, we could be 3 months away from the actual final harvest price being settled. And, a lot of things can happen in the meantime, and we did see flutters there when, you know, there was talk of some of that wheat coming out of Ukraine, and certainly the market dropped, you know, for a period of time on the back of that news. And, you know, I suppose on the flip side then we're, you know, on the news today, we're hearing about heat waves and the impact that that's having in Europe and actually in America as well. So look, it is very volatile, Michael, I suppose, really. But look, as I say, the current prices are in excess of 300, which is very, very welcome, albeit, you know, there was more there maybe a month ago, you know.
Okay. Listen, Ciarán, thanks so much for that. It's great to be a little bit optimistic, I suppose, at the end of any podcast or any section of stuff that we're doing with farmers, and prices are certainly positive. But I suppose, look, when it's all said and done, they're all kind of needed to fill in the whole of all the inputs that's gone out there. So listen, Ciarán, thanks very much. And Shay, thank you very much for your input as well. And guys, we'll be talking to you over the harvest again. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's all we've time for. And my thanks to Ciarán and Shay for joining me today on the podcast. There are a series of crop walks, which Shay mentioned earlier, from June the 28th to the 30th in Wexford, Cork and Tipperary. And these crops are looking at how to reduce tillage farming environmental footprint. For more details, go to teagasc.ie/events. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, and recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.